The sun sets over Rome in the year 476 after Christ. The marble columns cast long shadows across empty streets where once mighty legions marched in triumph. The Eternal City, a place that had commanded the known world for nearly 1,000 years, now lies broken and vulnerable. In the palace, a teenage emperor trembles. His name is Romulus Augustulus, barely 16 years old, and in a twist of fate that seems almost too poetic to be true, he bears the same name as Rome's legendary founder. But unlike the Romulus of old who built an empire, this young ruler would witness its final breath. As the autumn winds blow through the corridors of power, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer approaches the city gates. The once mighty Roman army, now a shadow of its former glory, stands down without resistance. In a matter of days, the last Roman emperor would be stripped of his purple robes, ending an empire that had ruled from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. But how did we get here? How did a civilization that gave us roads still used today, aqueducts that defied engineering limits, and laws that form the backbone of modern justice systems, simply fade away? The story is far more complex than simple invasion and defeat. Think of Rome as a mighty oak tree, its roots stretching deep into the soil of history. Did it fall because barbarian axes finally broke through its trunk? Or had insects been quietly hollowing it out from within for centuries, corruption eating away at its core, economic crisis weakening its branches, and civil wars splitting its bark? What makes this story particularly fascinating is how familiar it feels. A superpower struggling with political division, economic upheaval, and the challenges of maintaining vast territories. Sound familiar? As we peel back the layers of Rome's decline, you might find yourself drawing surprising parallels with our modern world. Join me on this journey through time as we uncover the real story behind history's most famous collapse. We'll walk the streets of ancient Rome, meet the characters who shaped its destiny, and perhaps most importantly, understand the warnings this ancient tale holds for our own civilization. This isn't just another history lesson, it's a story of power, ambition, and the price of empire. A story that reminds us that even the mightiest of civilizations can crumble when they forget the principles that made them great. So, are you ready to discover how the mightiest empire in history fell? Let's begin our journey through the twilight years of ancient Rome and uncover the truth behind its legendary fall. Before we dive into Rome's fall, we need to understand what made it great in the first place. Imagine a world where you could travel from Scotland to Egypt without ever leaving Roman territory, using the same currency, speaking the same language, and being protected by the same laws. This wasn't fantasy. This was the Roman Empire at its height. It all began with Augustus, Rome's first true emperor, in 27 before Christ. He ushered in an era known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a golden age that would last for 2 centuries. During this remarkable period, the Mediterranean world experienced something it had never known before: stability on an unprecedented scale. Picture yourself walking through Rome during this golden age. The streets are bustling with merchants from distant lands, silk traders from China, spice dealers from India, amber merchants from the Baltic. The city itself is a marvel of engineering and architecture. The Colosseum rises 8 stories high, while the aqueducts deliver fresh mountain water to millions of residents. This is Rome at its zenith, home to over 1 million people, a population level that wouldn't be matched in Europe until London in the 18th century. But beneath this glittering surface, dangerous cracks were forming. You see, Rome had built its economy on a simple but flawed principle: constant expansion. Like a shark that needs to keep swimming to survive, Rome needed to keep conquering to thrive. Each new conquest brought slaves, gold, and exotic treasures flowing into Roman coffers. But what happens when there's nothing left to conquer? By the time of Emperor Hadrian, around 120 after Christ, Rome had reached its natural limits. To the north lay dense Germanic forests, where legions struggled to operate. To the east was the powerful Parthian Empire. To the south stretched the uncrossable Sahara Desert, and to the west, well, there was only ocean. Here's where things get interesting. Maintaining this vast empire required enormous resources. Think about it. Rome needed to guard a border that stretched for over 10,000 miles. That meant paying and feeding thousands of soldiers, maintaining roads and fortresses, and dealing with endless local disputes. It was like trying to keep a giant plate spinning. The bigger it got, the harder it became to control. And there was another problem, one that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. Rome had become addicted to slave labor from its conquests. Why develop better farming tools or more efficient methods when you have an endless supply of free workers? But when the conquests slowed, so did the supply of slaves. The economy had to adapt, and Rome wasn't very good at adapting. The Pax Romana was like a beautiful summer afternoon, peaceful, prosperous, seemingly endless. But just as every summer must eventually turn to autumn, the seeds of Rome's destruction were already taking root during its greatest days. The empire had grown too large, too dependent on expansion, and too resistant to change. What makes this story so fascinating is how these same patterns keep repeating throughout history. Even today, we can see modern superpowers wrestling with similar challenges. The costs of maintaining global influence, the dangers of economic inflexibility, and the constant struggle to adapt to changing times. The glory of Rome wasn't just in its marble columns or mighty legions. It was in creating a world where different peoples and cultures could live together under common laws and values. But maintaining that world would prove to be its greatest challenge, and ultimately, its undoing. If Rome's golden age was like a beautiful summer afternoon, the 3rd century after Christ was like a perfect storm. Imagine everything that could go wrong with an empire happening all at once. That's what Rome faced during this devastating period. Let me paint you a picture of just how chaotic things became. In the span of just 50 years, Rome burned through more than 20 emperors. And we're not talking about peaceful transitions of power. Most of these emperors met violent ends. Being emperor of Rome became the most dangerous job in history. One unfortunate ruler, Quintillus, lasted only 17 days before being murdered by his own troops. Here's a particularly wild story that captures the madness of the era. In the year 238 after Christ, the Senate proclaimed 2 co-emperors, a father and son named Gordian. They ruled for exactly 21 days before being killed. The Senate then appointed 2 more emperors, who started fighting each other almost immediately. One was dragged through the streets of Rome and killed by a mob, while the other was murdered by his own guards. And this was just one typical month in Rome's 3rd century. But the political chaos was just the beginning. The economy went into a death spiral that would make modern financial crises look tame. Remember those silver coins that were once the pride of Rome? Well, emperors desperate for money started mixing in cheaper metals. By the year 268, Roman coins contained barely 5% silver. Imagine trying to buy bread with money that everyone knows is worthless. That's what Romans faced every day. The results were catastrophic. Inflation skyrocketed so high that soldiers were sometimes paid in actual food and clothing because money had become meaningless. A single loaf of bread that once cost half a denarius now cost hundreds of thousands. People started bartering instead of using money, and the sophisticated Roman economy began to crumble. Meanwhile, Rome's enemies sensed weakness. Persian armies invaded from the east, Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube rivers, and pirates raided coastal cities with impunity. Plague swept through the empire, killing thousands daily. Some historians estimate that Rome's population dropped by more than half during this period. Enter Diocletian, a former slave who fought his way up through the ranks to become emperor in 284. He looked at this mess and decided to completely reinvent how Rome was governed. He split the empire into 4 parts, each with its own ruler. He froze prices to fight inflation, reorganized the provinces, and created a new tax system. On paper, these reforms saved the empire. The chaos subsided, and Rome survived. But here's the thing about treating symptoms rather than causes. The underlying problems don't go away. Diocletian's reforms were like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house with a crumbling foundation. Sure, it looked better, but the structural problems remained. Perhaps the most lasting damage was psychological. Romans lost faith in their institutions, in their currency, and in the idea of Rome itself. The empire survived the crisis of the 3rd century, but it emerged as something different, more authoritarian, less creative, and fundamentally less Roman. This period holds an eerie mirror to our own times. When we see modern countries struggling with political instability, currency devaluation, and loss of public trust, we're watching some of the same forces that tore through Rome almost 2,000 years ago. The crisis of the 3rd century wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. It was a preview of the empire's eventual fall, a dress rehearsal for the final act that would come 2 centuries later. When we think of Rome's fall, we often picture hordes of barbarians storming the gates. But the real story is far more complex and, honestly, more fascinating. It begins not with an invasion, but with a desperate plea for help. Imagine you're living in Rome in the year 376 after Christ. Word arrives that a mysterious people called the Huns have appeared from the east. They're unlike anything anyone has seen before. Skilled mounted archers who seem to live on horseback. They're not interested in conquering Rome. They're pursuing another group, the Goths, who are now trapped between the unstoppable Huns and Rome's borders. The Goths send ambassadors to Rome, begging for sanctuary. They offer their strongest men as soldiers in exchange for land to farm. Rome agrees, but here's where things get interesting. The Roman officials in charge of settling the Goths decide to exploit them instead. They force the Goths to sell their children into slavery just to get enough food to survive. Not surprisingly, this doesn't end well. The Goths revolt, and in 378, they face the Roman army at Adrianople, in modern-day Turkey. What happens next sends shockwaves through the empire. The barbarians don't just defeat the Romans, they annihilate them. The Emperor Valens himself dies on the battlefield, his body never to be found. Now, here's the irony that would make the ancient Romans roll in their graves. Rome increasingly turns to barbarian warriors to defend itself. These aren't just random mercenaries. We're talking about entire Germanic tribes being enlisted to protect Roman borders. Imagine hiring the very people you're trying to keep out to guard your front door. This leads us to one of the most dramatic moments in Roman history, the year 410 after Christ. Alaric, a Gothic king who had once served in the Roman army, stands before the walls of Rome itself. He's not some mindless barbarian. He's a sophisticated leader who speaks Latin and understands Roman politics better than many Romans. For 3 days, Alaric's forces plunder the Eternal City. It's the first time in 800 years that Rome has fallen to a foreign enemy. The psychological impact is devastating. Imagine if Washington, D.C. or London were captured today. That's how shocking this was to the Roman world. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, captures the mood perfectly. The city which had conquered the world was itself conquered. But here's what's truly fascinating. Alaric didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted to be part of it. He had repeatedly asked for lands and official titles within the empire. It was only after being refused and betrayed multiple times that he turned against Rome. The barbarians weren't simply mindless destroyers. Many of them admired Roman civilization and wanted to preserve it, just under their leadership. The reality is that Rome's boundaries had become more like a sieve than a wall. People, ideas, and cultures flowed both ways. Many barbarian leaders wore Roman clothes, spoke Latin, and considered themselves more Roman than barbarian. The line between Roman and barbarian had become increasingly blurred. This raises an interesting question. Did Rome fall to foreign invaders, or did it transform into something new? When Alaric's successors took control of various parts of the empire, they kept Roman laws, used Roman titles, and preserved much of Roman culture. In many ways, they became the new Romans. Think about that for a moment. Perhaps Rome's greatest strength Its ability to absorb and integrate other peoples ultimately contributed to its transformation. The empire didn't simply die, it gradually morphed into something different, something that would eventually give birth to medieval Europe. So what do you think? Could Rome have survived if it had handled the barbarian migrations differently? What would have happened if they had truly integrated the Goths as equal partners instead of trying to exploit them? Could better leadership have prevented the fall, or was this transformation inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this pivotal moment in history. In the year 395 after Christ, Emperor Theodosius made a fateful decision that would change the course of history forever. On his deathbed, he split the mighty Roman Empire between his two sons. Arcadius would rule the east from Constantinople, while Honorius would govern the west from Rome. Little did he know that this division would lead to two drastically different fates. Picture this: two brothers, two empires, two destinies. The Eastern Empire, blessed with incredible advantages, would survive and thrive for another 1,000 years. But the Western Empire, it would collapse in less than a century. The question is, why such different outcomes? Let's start with the East. Constantinople, its magnificent capital, was a natural fortress. Situated on a peninsula between two seas, it boasted massive walls that would repel invaders for centuries. These weren't just any walls, they were engineering marvels, 3 layers deep, equipped with advanced defensive technologies that would make modern military engineers envious. But the East's true strength lay in its incredible wealth. It controlled the richest provinces of the old empire: Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Egypt alone provided enough grain to feed Constantinople's population, and still have plenty left for trade. The Silk Road passing through its territories brought exotic goods and massive tax revenues. While the West struggled to pay its soldiers, the East's coffers remained full. Meanwhile, the Western Empire faced a perfect storm of problems. Its leadership was, to put it mildly, abysmal. Instead of capable emperors, the West got a succession of weak rulers, many of them children manipulated by corrupt advisors. Young Honorius, for instance, was more interested in his pet chicken, also named Rome, than in actually governing Rome. The West's infrastructure was literally crumbling. Roads that once carried legions swiftly across the empire fell into disrepair. Aqueducts that supplied cities with fresh water were damaged and never fixed. Trade declined, cities shrank, and the economy spiraled downward. The West had lost its wealthiest provinces to the East and couldn't generate enough tax revenue to maintain its army or basic services. Here's a fascinating detail. While the Western Empire struggled to defend its borders, the East developed a sophisticated diplomatic system. They would play potential invaders against each other, use gold to buy peace when needed, and maintain an efficient spy network that kept them informed of threats well in advance. The tale of these two Romes shows us how geography, economics, and leadership can shape the destiny of nations. The East adapted and survived, eventually becoming what we know as the Byzantine Empire. The West, clinging to old ways and crippled by poor governance, faded into history. It's a stark reminder that even the mightiest can fall when they fail to adapt to changing times. While barbarian armies gathered at Rome's borders, the empire was already bleeding from within. What many don't realize is that Rome's greatest enemy wasn't wielding swords or spears. It was wearing togas in lavish villas. Imagine this: wealthy Roman senators hosting extravagant feasts in their countryside mansions, serving exotic dishes like peacock tongues and flamingo brains, while their tax collectors turned away empty-handed. These elites had mastered the art of tax evasion, creating elaborate schemes to hide their wealth. They would often claim their vast estates were worth far less than their true value, or register their properties under the names of poor citizens who were exempt from taxation. The rich got richer, and the empire got poorer. Here's the cruel irony. These same senators would give passionate speeches about patriotism and Roman virtue, all while starving the very state they claimed to serve. The army, which desperately needed funds to defend against barbarian threats, often went unpaid. Soldiers began deserting or worse, switching sides to join the invaders who could offer them better compensation. But perhaps the most ingenious way Rome's elite maintained their power was through what we now call bread and circuses. They kept the masses distracted with free grain distributions and spectacular gladiatorial games. Did you know that the Colosseum could hold up to 50,000 spectators? While people cheered for their favorite gladiators, they weren't paying attention to the empire crumbling around them. The government tried to cope by debasing the currency, mixing less and less silver into the coins. By the end, Roman coins contained barely a trace of precious metal. Inflation skyrocketed. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 denarius now cost thousands. The middle class was wiped out, leaving a massive gap between the ultra-wealthy and the desperately poor. And then came the final act of this tragedy. In the year 476 after Christ, a Germanic warrior chief named Odoacer decided enough was enough. The last Western Roman emperor was, ironically, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Imagine that, Rome's final emperor bearing the name of its legendary founder, Romulus. History does have a sense of humor, doesn't it? Romulus Augustulus was barely 16 years old when Odoacer marched into Rome. Unlike previous invaders, Odoacer didn't bother maintaining the pretense of Roman authority. He simply deposed the young emperor and sent him into exile with a generous pension. No blood was shed. Rome didn't go out with a bang, but with a whimper. The fascinating part? Many Romans barely noticed the difference. The wealthy continued their feasts. The games continued in the Colosseum, and life went on. The empire had been so hollow for so long that its final collapse was almost an afterthought. As one contemporary writer noted, Rome was conquered by its own vices long before it was conquered by barbarian virtues. It's a sobering reminder that great civilizations rarely fall to external enemies alone. Like a mighty oak tree that appears strong on the outside but is rotting within, Rome's impressive facade masked terminal decay. The barbarians didn't have to break down the gates. They simply walked through doors that corruption had already opened for them. Let's play a fascinating game of what if. Could the Western Roman Empire have survived? The answer might surprise you, because its eastern twin, operating under similar challenges, managed to thrive for another 1,000 years. Think of Rome's fall not as inevitable, but as a series of missed opportunities. The Eastern Empire faced the same threats: barbarian invasions, economic pressures, social unrest, yet it adapted and survived. So what could the West have done differently? First, let's talk military reforms. The Eastern Empire revolutionized its army, creating the highly effective comitatenses, mobile field armies that could rapidly respond to threats. They also maintained the limitani, frontier troops who combined military duties with farming. This dual system proved remarkably effective. The West, meanwhile, clung to outdated military traditions and relied increasingly on unreliable mercenaries. Here's a fascinating detail. The Eastern Empire developed an incredible military technology called Greek fire, a mysterious flame that could burn even on water. Imagine if the West had invested in similar military innovations instead of merely trying to buy off its enemies. The economic solutions were staring them right in the face. The Eastern Empire maintained a stable gold currency called the solidus, so trusted it was used for international trade for centuries. Meanwhile, the West kept debasing its currency until its coins contained barely any precious metal at all. A radical economic restructuring, similar to what Emperor Diocletian attempted in the 3rd century after Christ, might have saved the Western economy. But perhaps the most crucial reform needed was in tax collection. The Eastern Empire developed an efficient civil service that actually collected taxes from wealthy landowners. Imagine if the Western Empire had done the same. They could have maintained a professional army, repaired crucial infrastructure, and possibly even prevented the economic collapse that led to their downfall. Here's another intriguing possibility. What if the West had adopted the Eastern practice of controlled immigration? Instead of viewing all barbarians as enemies, the East successfully integrated many Germanic tribes into their society and military. They became valuable citizens rather than dangerous outsiders. The Eastern Empire also invested heavily in education and bureaucratic efficiency. While Western Roman officials were often chosen based on wealth or family connections, the East maintained a merit-based system that produced more competent leadership. A similar approach in the West might have prevented the succession of weak emperors that plagued its final years. And speaking of leadership, what if the West had followed the Eastern example of maintaining a professional civil service? In Constantinople, government continued functioning smoothly even when emperors were assassinated or overthrown. The West, by contrast, often descended into chaos with each succession crisis. Perhaps most importantly, the East understood something crucial. Adaptation isn't weakness. They weren't afraid to reform traditional Roman institutions when necessary. They combined Roman organizational skills with Greek cultural sophistication and Oriental diplomatic finesse. The West, tragically, often saw change as a betrayal of Roman traditions. The bitter truth is that the Western Roman Empire probably could have survived. The solutions were there, demonstrated by their Eastern counterparts. They needed military modernization, economic reform, and most importantly, the wisdom to adapt to changing times. It's a powerful lesson that echoes through history. Survival doesn't always mean keeping things the same. Sometimes it means having the courage to change while keeping your core values intact. The Eastern Empire proved that it was possible to remain Roman while evolving with the times. The West's failure wasn't inevitable. It was a choice, made day by day to cling to an unsustainable past rather than adapt to a challenging future. What do you think? If you were transported back in time and made emperor of the Western Roman Empire, which of these reforms would you implement first? The fate of Rome might have rested on just such decisions. As our journey through the fall of Rome comes to an end, let's take a moment to reflect on this extraordinary tale of rise and decline. You know, there's an old saying that Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, it certainly didn't fall in one either. What we've witnessed is more like a slow suicide spanning generations. Think about it. Rome wasn't destroyed by a single catastrophic event or an unstoppable enemy. Instead, it died from 1,000 cuts, each one self-inflicted. The proud empire that once ruled from Britain to Egypt gradually poisoned itself with hubris, greed, and a stubborn refusal to adapt. But here's the fascinating thing about Rome. Even in death, it never truly died. Look around you. Do you speak English, French, Spanish, or Portuguese? These languages carry Latin's DNA. Are you familiar with legal terms like habeas corpus or pro bono? That's Roman law still speaking to us across the centuries. Even the concept of citizenship rights that we hold dear today was first developed in Roman courts. The Romans gave us concrete that could set underwater, architectural marvels like the Pantheon's dome that remained the world's largest for 13 centuries, and a road network so well built that many of their routes are still used today. They pioneered concepts in engineering, architecture, and urban planning that we still study and use. Yet perhaps Rome's greatest legacy is the warning it left us. No empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. The Romans themselves had a fascinating tradition. During triumphal parades, when generals celebrated their victories through Rome's streets, a slave would stand behind them, holding a golden crown while whispering in their ear, "Remember, you are mortal." It's almost poetic how Rome's fall continues to teach us. When we see modern societies struggling with wealth inequality, political corruption, or military overextension, we're watching Rome's old demons dancing in new costumes. The questions that plagued Rome still echo today. How do we balance security with freedom? How do we maintain unity amid diversity? How do we adapt to change while preserving our core values? But let's end on a hopeful note. Rome's fall wasn't just an ending, it was also a beginning. From its ashes rose new kingdoms, new ideas, and new ways of organizing society. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years, preserving and transforming Roman civilization. Medieval Europe, the Islamic Golden Age, and even the Renaissance all built upon Roman foundations. Perhaps that's the most important lesson. Civilizations don't truly die, they transform. The light of human achievement, like the eternal flame of Vesta that the Romans guarded so carefully, doesn't go out. It gets passed on, changing hands, changing forms, but always illuminating the way forward. As we close this chapter of history, remember that we're not just students of Rome's past. We're heirs to its legacy. Every time we participate in democratic governance, every time we advocate for justice under law, every time we build something meant to last for generations, we're keeping a piece of Rome alive. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey through the twilight of Rome. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, remember to like this video and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles. There are so many more incredible tales from history waiting to be told, so many lessons waiting to be learned. Join our community of history enthusiasts, and let's continue exploring the amazing stories that shaped our world together. Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and where we might be heading. As the Romans would say, veil, farewell.